Hello and welcome to this week's 52 Weeks. This week we're continuing in Chapter 8, Economic Development, and this is the final segment that wraps up this chapter. As we've been looking at this Economic Development chapter, understanding that the Economic Development chapter recommends that the city focuses on three main priorities. One of the first segments we looked at was priority number 1, the maintenance industry. The second priority, which is last week, was strengthening the transportation hub. And this week, we're going to be looking at expanding Harrisburg's private business sector. And when we look at this priority for expanding Harrisburg's private business sector, there's a quote in the comp plan that starts it off. The city must change structurally vacant land to concentrated mixed-use commercial areas or ecological buffers, accelerating the spatial and economic transformation from industrial boomtown through the Rust Belt period to a physically and economically sustainable community. This is a critical piece to understand, is that the business sector plays into this. Is also private-public partnerships that are happening, and it's got to be led by a process. What's fascinating is you start to see this mixed-use commercial areas and some of the pressures that we're finding within outside of Harrisburg coming in the push in some of the neighborhoods. And when I say that the planning process is broken in Harrisburg, it is that there's no mediation, there's no agency that's helping to mediate the outside pressures. So what's happening is the neighborhoods are now feeling this pressure, and there's no formal way to critically analyze what these pressures are, what the products are that people are bringing to the table, and how do we evaluate them within our city. You know, if we have all these products coming at us, we have no ways to discern which it works best because we haven't looked at the urban design, we haven't done any planning, we haven't looked at the social economic structures within our communities. We haven't looked at it from a triple bottom line of people, place, and economics. We're pretty much screwing ourselves because we haven't gone through our own education in ourselves and our learning and evaluation to see what fits. And what's scary is that when others come from the outside putting things in to think that they're going to fit, it's usually that the products fit them more than the people that are here. It's great when we get a nice balance and a social equity that's mutually beneficial in a symbiotic relationship that is mutualism, is that both people benefit, but typically investors are going to come in and look at it from a return on investment type of viewpoint. If they get no pressure from the residents, they get no pressure from any entities that hold them accountable, is what we'll continue to get, is what we see in other cities, is displacement and more gaps in wealth, gaps in access, gaps in mobility. So if we really want to be critical for 2020, this is where we need to focus. In essence, regionally where we're at, we can build urban densities or conserve the land. We want to avoid low-density development, which creates inefficient use of land and infrastructure. Right there pretty much sums up where we're at in central PA. If you look at the housing boom that's happening all around Harrisburg, it's a lot of decentralized planning. There's no coordinated infrastructure. A lot of these are developments that are isolated and you need vehicles to get around. And that is costly. It's also costly in a taxpayer mindset because things are spread out and we're not utilizing, we're not conserving, we're not even considering that there's changes within the climate, and we've got to do a better job of how we inhabit the landscape. If you look at this transect, which is from DPZ, Andreas Duaney developed this in understanding our relationship from high density to totally natural. We have to come up with a plan regionally. This is part of the smart growth ideas that are here, is how do we inhabit the land and do it in a way that is triple bottom line for the people that live there, the planet, the place that's there, as well as the economics. So when we focus on the city of Harrisburg, it goes back into the 1974 plan. Since 1974, all major buildings recommended in the original Harristown plan have been completed. So we've accomplished that mission. Having fulfilled its original mission by the 1990s, Harristown Development Corporation has looked to renovate and revitalize the downtown's remaining block of historic building stock through the South of Market Initiative, that's SOMA. Harristown's early major building development, Strawberry Square and 333 Market Street, are now over 40 years old. What to consider with some of these buildings is that this is the point of a building's life cycle where major renovation of a building's facade, mechanical systems, and technology are customary. This offers Harrisburg with the opportunity to refresh its skyline during the 20-year implementation period of the comprehensive plan. So in the next 2 decades, there's an opportunity to add more buildings to our city's skyline. And so there's some ideas within the comprehensive plan that are studies of what could be, envisioning what could be. This is where I think our greatest asset in the city is a collaborative of community development that happens. This is public participatory planning where people come together and do charrettes to envision what their city looks like. A lot of things that have already developed happen because of someone else's ideas put into the city. Goal 8.7, industrial boomtown to Rust Belt to sustainable city. These are the steps that we can get to. Since the period of the industrial decline, former industrial properties of the city have revealed themselves to be, in effect, structurally vacant. So we know that these are things where they're structurally vacant because they're now not contributing to the vibrancy of communities. Key to further this transformation of the city to a fully post-industrial form is the definitive repositioning of former industrial properties using 3 options. So what do we do with these industrial properties? We can continue to use as legacy industry where it still exists, reposition for new post-industrial use, a remove from market, removal of the land in floodplains as discussed in the land use chapter, so that we be a little bit more critical in where we build on the landscape, particularly when it has to deal with flooding. Objective 8.7.1 reinforce the distinctive identities with economic opportunities of the river, hill, and downtown districts to realize the unique economic opportunities of each of the city's district and program each district to serve a unique role in the city's economy. This is critical to understand the value of each of the communities and how they're interrelated across the city. This all can be coordinated through the community groups and working together and seeing vision of what our city is, instead of the narrative that is projected on us from the outside. In a quote pulling this together, in order for the whole city to prosper, the plan must communicate how completely different the hill, the river, downtown districts are and develop their differentiating assets accordingly. So it's more of an internal assessment of what we all provide within our community groups. It's knowing that Midtown's not the same as Allison Hill, nor is it the same as Camp Curtin, but we're all related somehow in some of the common pieces. This is where the neighborhood learning network is necessary, or professional learning community is necessary to share this information together and plan together, and that it's done within evidence-based shared goals and activities as well as measures. Action 8.7.1.1, focus planning for the Hill District as a regional asset. Quote from the comp plan, for example, the Hill has direct access to the interstate highway system at 13th, 17th, and 19th Streets. National retail site selection matrices require visual access to a given number of cars per day, usually in the mid-tens of thousands. The Hill District provides this. A new large daily market on the Hill can be accessed directly from the interstate. This provides the Hill with a fundamentally different relationship to the region. It can target the needs of diverse communities across the region, and throughout this, create a place of fascinating and diverse experiences for all. Action 8.7.1.2, structure development in the River District to facilitate a self-contained pedestrian core community. Quote, the Open Space Chapter 4 recommends a highly pedestrianized zone of the city between Forster and Harris Streets, which should perform as a regional art, culture, and leisure destination. Continuing on, Objective 8.7.2, assure high-quality commercial space is available for competing prices at all times. The vacancy rates are usually between 3 and 5%. We have limited rateable, separately comparable 10,000 square foot Class A spaces, and we also have very rare 20,000 square foot Class A spaces. So we look at larger companies that may need these types of floor plates. This can be a whole assessment around our city and what's provided. And this data is probably out there and already in the marketplace for real estate. The issue here is to try to figure out how to develop. We need to look at the needs that relate local, regional, and national and thread those together. Action 8.7.2.1, maintain a reserve of high quality commercial space under separate ownership and management available at the city at all times. Who are the single owners around the city, and how does that get to be more diversified? Quote, the city needs to focus on creating a reserve of high quality medium to large plate buildings built to a national rateable Class A standard. New space should be distributed in mid-rise commercial and residential buildings that will spread density through larger commercial zones in the city. In the last segment, we looked at what the community groups could be doing through small area plans, and here is really the highlight of the development in Goal 8.1 is what the city can be doing in preparing itself and looking at it from a long-term point of view. The city must prepare area master plans for all major commercial investment zones. It must select independent master developers, must also coordinate and sequence activities of those master developers. It must maintain a reserve fund to guarantee carrying rents on new provisionally vacant property. And lastly, sequence development to assure new building is always in the pipeline. So this is what the city should be administering. That's its job to do, and make sure this is really economic development 101, and this is the approach for the next 2 decades. Objective 8.7.3, assure national site selection groups can always find commercial space available or near completion in the city. Quote from the comp plan, in order to provide enough reserve space under separate ownership at all times, Harrisburg needs to transform from a laissez-faire model to planned sequenced commercial development model. Continuing the quotes, even in Harrisburg, the last high-quality building was a function of the Harristown Plan, a publicly supported, centrally planned, concerted effort to rebuilding the city's downtown in the early 1970s. Objective 8.7.4, coordinate planning of the 3 commercial development areas, target each to a separate business cluster. And a quote, as a result of urban renewal practices in the 1960s and 70s, the city has very large areas of land ready to be repositioned for new commercial and mixed-use development. These are the external pressures that I've talked about, is that these have been on the books for years, and there's been many plans that have been put forth. The challenge here is trying to get them to move forward into action. And I think it's only through the working together of neighborhood groups and the city thinking in a sustainable way that this is going to be possible. I think the failure failure in all this has been solely focused on economic development and not people, place, and economics. We looked at things from economics. If we provide something and provide for the market, it will draw them in. And we've seen that has not occurred. It's only been through the last decade that we've seen more of what the detrimental effects of this economic development have been on the residents of the city. And I think that's the transition into being more equitable in the process. And that's where the public participatory process and grassroots effort really needs to take hold. And I think we're getting there. The 2016 Comprehensive Plan offers a strategy to address the structurally vacant properties with the planned development of 3 mixed-use developments, each specifically targeted to an existing sustainable economic market cluster. These 3 areas are number 1, the Ridge, government and government services. Number 2 is downtown Gateway, nutrition, food sciences, healthcare. And number 3, transportation-oriented development area, financial services, insurance, logistics administration, and hospitality. Action 8.7.4.1, master plan 3 new mixed-use development areas targeted on local economic strengths. So we need approximately 10 million square foot of new mixed-use space. Currently, there's 3.5 million square foot of space. And from the 2040 HATS Regional Transportation Plan predicts a regional job growth of 21%, which is 37,000 jobs. That job growth is roughly equal to the current daytime working population of Harrisburg. So stop and think about that. For example, if Harrisburg develops capacity to accommodate 1/3 of the predicted regional job growth over the next 15 years, that would require approximately 3 million square foot of commercial space, almost doubling the city's current stock of commercial space. And this goes back into sustainability and how we inhabit the landscape. And again, focusing on these 3 areas, number 1, the Ridge, Northern Gateway, number 2, I-83 corridor, number 3, transit-oriented development. All these are critical for future development in Harrisburg and are important in coordination. So continuing with a quote in the comp plan, these 3 new development areas must be coordinated to ensure that they are not competitive, but they are mutually reinforcing, with each focused on developing specific facilities suited to separate business clusters. Action 8.7.4.2, commission economic base study to confirm economic cluster targets guiding the commercial and research and development areas. Action 8.7.4.3, master plan 2 new mixed-use development areas targeted on local economic strengths. Continuing with a reference back to 1974 general plan, what is important to recognize is that the compatible mix that must be planned for, not just for the predominant or the highest and best use in such situations. So this quote is important to look at what is the compatible mix, and this is where within asset-based mapping, it is good to be understanding what's around us and how to find that compatible mix. Action 8.7.4.4, master plan 3 makerspace incubator development areas targeted on local economic strengths. And action 8.7.4.5, in connection with the open space plan, identifying locations within parks and greens for carefully planned residential and commercial development. These are other areas that can be thought through in our core communities all around our city. And objective 8.7.5, prepare, approve, and adopt plans before initiating large-scale removal of buildings, generally anything large that has a half a block of fabric. So we should be very critical of the process in removing buildings, and we want to make sure our plans are already established before doing so. What has happened in Harrisburg is plans were put forth, there was no connection to those plans, the buildings were removed and demolished, and vacant lands are left. I put this map from the comp plan that shows the commercial cores and hubs that are important around the city to build the quality of capacity within those spaces. Action 8.7.5.1, provide expedited approvals for new construction in conformance with approved master plans. And Action 8.7.5, target land banking at sites planned for strategic redevelopment, otherwise restore the fabric, thus avoiding the creation of structurally vacant land. We want to make sure that we go through a planning process and that before anything's removed, there's a plan for what happens if it doesn't go through. This wraps up a good portion of Part 3, Economic Development, focus on priority number 3, which is the private business sector. Please continue to Part 2 of this segment to complete Chapter 8, Economic Development. Thank you very much, and take care.